point in the last 10 years or so, we seem to have got used to the idea that we're being constantly monitored, that every link we click, every bus fare we buy, every Instagram video we linger over for a few extra seconds is being crunched into data by a system that we'll never get to see or understand, but which has an extraordinary impact on our lives. The ads we're exposed to, the news in our feeds, how our bosses rate our performance at work, how much a ride home is going to cost. And it's no longer some malevolent, all-seeing Big Brother we're talking about, but something comparatively cosy: the algo. On social media, the algorithm that determines what you see on screen is kind of like an opponent in a video game. You can beat it if you know the cheat codes. But in the real world, algorithms are becoming the central organising force of many workplaces, replacing the visible authority of the boss with the invisible authority of a system, one that operates through the real-time tracking of workers through scanners, screens, and wearable devices. We already know about the horrors of algorithmic workplaces like Uber, who've long been squeezing driver pay in their quest for profitability, and Amazon, where harsh work quotas prevent delivery drivers from taking loo breaks, sometimes leaving them with no choice but to dump bottles of their own urine outside fulfillment centres. And this type of workplace, one ruled over by algorithmic management, poses a new set of problems for workers as they try to resist their exploitation. How can you organise a strike when the computer system that tells you what to do all day also keeps you physically separated from your colleagues? I'm Chal Ravens, Head of Audio at Novara Media, and if you haven't heard my voice on NovaraFM before, that's because I'm emerging from the safety of the production suite for the first time this week to talk to Craig Gent, North of England editor for Novara Media. Craig's new book, which came out this summer through Verso, is the ominously titled Cyberboss: The Rise of Algorithmic Management and the New Struggle for Control at Work. In order to write it, he returned to the tradition of the workers' inquiry, speaking to Amazon warehouse packers, Deliveroo drivers, and supermarket shoppers about labouring under the algorithm and the strange forms of resistance that emerge when even your boss has no idea how the system actually works. I spoke to Craig about the ways in which new technology is misunderstood as progress rather than a power struggle, why trade unions seem so weak in the face of big algo, and whether or not we should be feeling just a tiny bit sorry for the managers too. Craig Gent, welcome to Novara FM.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
I know you as a North of England editor for Novara Media, but of course you wear many hats at Novara Media. Meanwhile, you have been writing this book, somehow managed to squeeze that in as well. I think a good place to start would be if you could tell me a bit about the genesis of Cyberboss and what brought you to this idea of algorithmic management in the first place.
I suppose I've been interested in, like a lot of people on the left, I've been interested in work for a long time as a sort of, not just a sort of like a central feature of like capitalism, but the central bit of it that we see in our daily lives, interact with all the time. And I got into thinking about the role of technology in the reorganization of work, particularly like across history and stuff. And I suppose around the time that the genesis of this book emerged, there was a big discourse unfolding around the future of work and this general sense that not only do we have to contend with a degradation of conditions, precariousness, but that this has something to do with different forms of technologies that are being deployed within work. And it seemed to bring up many like familiar company names that we can think of, you know, like the ASOSs and the Sports Directs and the Amazons of the world. And those companies almost seem to, their names almost seem to sort of, be a sort of byword for a different set of working conditions. It wasn't really until I got going that algorithmic management started being applied as a phrase to gig work in particular. But once I started thinking through that lens, I think it made me realize that what we're talking about is not just how workers are affected by technologies, but how power within the workplace is actually being organized and reorganized.
You spend quite a good chunk of the book actually just explaining how various jobs work under this algorithmic management idea. In particular, you speak to food delivery app drivers, online shoppers at supermarkets, so the people who are actually doing your shopping your online orders for you, and packers at an Amazon warehouse. It's really illuminating, because I think most of us have no idea what it's like to do these jobs, because you don't really get to see them. And as you explain, what makes these jobs worthy of investigation here is that they are controlled and directed by systems that we can't see, which are only visible to these workers through, say, apps or kind of wearable devices that are telling them what to do and how well they're doing it. And in particular with the warehouse workers, the Amazon packers, I realised I had no idea how that job actually worked. And what you describe is actually, I think, quite different to how one might think that it works. And I just couldn't help but think the whole process comes off as being incredibly secretive, not just to the general public, but even to the workers themselves. Is this opacity a kind of standard feature of the algorithmic workplace? Is it inevitable?
You know, when you think about a lot of these companies, they are really selling this idea to consumers as much as anything else, you know, of being kind of like seamless and smooth and frictionless. And so it kind of really makes sense that, you know, within the kind of like popular imaginary, they kind of have this almost like sort of slick veneer to them, you know, and the fact that you can order something and get it arrived the next day or the same day in some places, weirdly actually sort of like lends itself to this idea of a very sort of smooth process rather than an incredibly intense and labor intensive process. Obviously, like, I think nothing is inevitable, but I think certainly this idea of like those workplaces being secretive is in accordance with the level of control that is involved in order to maintain that kind of rate of production, if you like. And also, like, I mean, in terms of literal security, you definitely see very low trust in workers and very high security in a lot of places. So, for example, one workplace I looked at, people as they're going in are all subjected to a security check, but they also have to press a sort of a randomizer button that will tell them whether or not they're going to be picked for an even higher level, more sort of invasive, security check as they're sort of going in or out of the warehouse.
Which was quite different to your experience when you went on a factory tour, right?
That's quite different, yeah. So I went on a couple of tours actually of an Amazon warehouse. The first one literally just to see. I mean, I think I describe it in the book as it was being a bit like the sort of North Korea Tourism Board version of the warehouse. And the second time, once I'd already sort of been on the tour and heard all the spiel, I sort of, you know, spent as much time as I could sort of looking anywhere but the guide, trying to sort of glean what I could. And by that point, thankfully, I'd also been able to chat to some Amazon workers. And so I had a bit of insight into what was behind some of the things that I was seeing. What
did you see in the Amazon warehouse that surprised you? Or what did you learn about the processes in there that gave you pause for thought?
The first thing that comes to mind is how hot it is. It's incredibly hot in a fulfillment center, and it was like a sort of like it sort of brought back memories for me, because when I was at the very start of the book, I talk about how when I was a teenager, I worked on like an assembly line for a high street clothing chain, sort of back end warehouse. And it was incredibly noisy and incredibly hot. And we also sort of work in shorts. And I'd really sort of forgotten that. So like hearing the noise of the machines is kind of like constant grinding. Because as well as having people walking around and all these sort of slick digital systems, you also have, you know, machinery in terms of sort of automated conveyor machineries and things like that. So you hear the noise, you get the heat. The other thing that really did surprise me actually is that when you're stood amongst the stacks where goods are stored, you know, like the kind of like the almost like library shelves full of, you know, everything from teddy bears to dildos, you can't actually really see many workers around. Like they are there, they're everywhere, but systems, the algorithmic system, the sort of picking systems are designed to avoid workers getting under each other's feet because it would be a hold up. And so actually working in a pick tower, for example, is like quite a lonely experience, because if things are working correctly, you shouldn't be bumping into any other workers. Now, of course, when the stacks either side of you are, 8 feet high and many meters long, you're sort of maybe seeing workers here and there at a distance, but you're not actually sort of seeing anyone face to face.
Listeners to this programme may also have watched a programme that was on telly last year by the journalist Uber Butler, who fronted a TV show called The Great Amazon Heist, in which he went undercover in an Amazon fulfillment centre and saw how the proverbial sausage was made, which included a little section about the fact that Amazon delivery drivers often have abandoned bottles of their own piss outside the entrances to the centres because they're not given time for toilet breaks on their rounds, right? And they're, obviously not allowed to leave these bottles in the vehicles. That it seems fair enough. So Uber Butler collects up these bottles, he repackages them, he puts them on Amazon, and through some sort of fiddling of the system, he sort of manages to briefly make them a best-selling drink on the site before Amazon get wind of it and take it down. All of which is to say, Amazon is like a known bad actor. I'd heard about the piss bottles previously, and I'd thought, well, that is hellish, isn't it? People have to be allowed time for toilet breaks, surely, simple stuff. But is there anything about this era of algorithmic management that is in any way unique in terms of how people are treated at work and the actual conditions that they have to deal with? So
I think it's definitely not the case that it's restricted to, big, almost in the industry, kind of high-end companies like Amazon, very sort of rich, lucrative companies. You see these technologies and the sort of systems of management at play all across logistics, and that's sort of where I mostly look in the book, because they're definitely, I would say, that's where we're sort of seeing the most like advanced forms of algorithmic management. But increasingly, we see them across retail and many other sectors as well. People will, if they frequent McDonald's with any degree of regularity, will have a sense that the workflow has completely changed and transformed in the last 10 years to how it used to be. And even the fact that a lot of McDonald's workers now are kind of working to a big sort of screen-based dashboard rather than customers, sort of changing the way that the work is organised and tracked. What I would say is new and particular is the real-time nature of the tracking. So algorithmic management depends on workers being tracked algorithmically through devices. They might be wearable devices, or they might be handheld scan guns, or it could be, smartphone because there's an app. And so there's this sort of real-time tracking that's happening instead of, in previous eras, we might have seen sort of like tallying happening at different moments. But real-time tracking means there can be real-time calculation, real-time, therefore, organization and reorganization of work based on what's optimal at a given time. And this affects the allocation of work, of course, but it also affects the workflow and the experience of working. It can affect workers' sense of time and space. Space, obviously, I just mentioned with how, the system structures workers geographically across a shop floor to not encounter each other. But time is an important one as well. Like, if you're an Amazon picker, for example, you have a certain number of seconds to get to your next item. And so constantly you're thinking about the next 12 seconds. And of course, all of these things have an enormously disruptive sort of, sabotaging effect on any prospect of like sociality in the workplace, which of course is, a precondition for example, organizing in your workplace.
So if we were to dig a bit deeper into this idea of algorithmic management, then, I mean, there is, of course, a whole story of industrialized production in the background here, from Taylorism and Fordism, this splitting up of production into individual tasks, and then the large-scale mechanization of that process, and then through into the latter half of the 20th century into post-Fordism, which, among other things, is marked by much more complex global supply chains, things like the arrival of the shipping container, and of course the transfer of so much industrial production to China, particularly the deindustrialization of so many towns and cities, particularly in the north of England. This is a story that we're quite familiar with, but I suppose it's worth thinking about how the flip side of the kind of post-Fordist moment is that it promised something to the workers as well. You know, workers also wanted more interesting jobs, more autonomy at work. Factories can be quite boring places to work. You know, so some of the demands that led to that deindustrialization, they weren't just coming from capital, but there were some demands from labour too for a greater sense of control over what you're working on. And I think it's notable that the pitch from companies like Uber and Deliveroo in particular is that you as the worker do have this apparent freedom to choose, you know, when do you want to work? How long do you want to work for? You can fit it around all your other jobs that you have to do. It's a job that's flexible to your needs. You know, that's how they want to frame it in some ways. Mm-hmm. So what's the reality of that in terms of workers having more control, more autonomy over how they work? And is algorithmic management therefore just another kind of era or aspect of post-Fordism, or does it suggest that we have entered a new era, maybe a new kind of production system?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm always a little bit wary of sort of periodizing like stages of capitalism or like production systems, like Fordism, post-Fordism. And I say that because I'm someone who used to do it a lot. And I used to really place a lot of value in it. But of course, it is the truth that, you know, post-Fordist forms of work. I mean, this is a sort of like Paolo Virno like hypothesis of, you know, how the sort of failed revolutions of the 70s, you know, subsequent to those, you know, we had the rise of neoliberalism, which delivered and this is the important part, in a deformed way, the demands typical of communism. And it goes as far as to call neoliberalism the communism of capital. And so things like, you know, less boredom, more flexibility arose in this deformed way as being flexible specialization and precariousness, for example. Now, obviously, you do now have those types of work and many types of work that didn't exist in previous eras. So, you know, there is sort of something to that. But at the same time, there are clearly, you know, still industries where a fundamentally Fordist sort of mode of production still dominates. The manufacture of food, for example, pre-prepared food. So like in the book, I think I talk more about Taylorism than Fordism, because I suppose why I'm interested in that is because where Ford, for example, was thinking about mechanizing the assembly line, and in that sense, a lot of sort of companies that went from being sort of Fordist, or industries that went from being Fordist to sort of post-Fordist, began to think about how their machines could be put towards many different uses, for example. Taylor, from the beginning, so Frederick Winslow Taylor, the management theorist, and I still kind of think we're in like a Taylorist paradigm, but he was interested in reorganizing the politics of knowledge at work, which I think is something that's only become like more and more apposite as like more work has become knowledge focused. What's interesting, I think, in relation to your question is that the introduction of algorithmic management systems are really based on kind of fundamentally cybernetic principles, which have at their root this kind of like ontology of unknowability, as the sort of historian of the philosophy of science, Andrew Pickering, says, which is this idea that instead of, you know, in the past, for example, like designing a work system that can be perfected into like a one best way, you instead have this kind of sense of like a real-time one best way that no person could ever really know or explain, but a computer system, a very advanced computer system, is able to keep on top of all the time and to keep reorganizing things in pursuance of this kind of like very specific one best way for this one particular moment. And that is kind of new and interesting, and actually, you know, despite the fact that we're supposedly in a kind of era where we're all more, working more creatively or having more agency, I think it actually does sort of suggest a degradation of work that's happening en masse.
Also thinking historically in that way, I mean, you offer this idea of the algorithmic panopticon, using Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon, which we tend to think of as a prison, a building designed in such a way that a guard can observe the prisoners without them knowing if they're being watched at that moment, right? So, I mean, could you just, first of all, just explain briefly how the algorithmic panopticon works, just following on from what you were saying there about the kind of the cybernetic control?
Yeah, so this idea, actually, I do kind of offer it, but I can't take credit for it. It comes from Jamie Woodcock and his work on Deliveroo. And I guess the way he's deploying it is because he's thinking about the way that in these workplaces, and this has been remarked in his work, my work, the journalist Sarah O'Connor, this sort of increasing sense that the algorithm is the boss. And that's obviously why I called the book Cyberboss. And so this idea that the algorithm has this kind of like panoptic vision, it's able to kind of see into all corners of the workplace, much as in Jeremy Bentham's sort of hypothetical design, the sort of central guard tower can see into all the prison cells. But I think the important thing to remember, and this is, I think, what Jamie Woodcock gets at, is that this is like quite a good metaphor, because following like Foucault, who obviously talked about the panopticon as well, and what he does differently to Bentham is he sort of switches it around, and he says, well, the crucial point is not that the guard can see into all the cells, it's that all the people in the cells think there is a guard watching them at any given moment from the middle, and they can't know whether or not there is a guard in the tower. And so the crucial point is that there is an illusion of control that kind of is backed up by this sort of sense of probability that you might be being watched, or in the case of the algorithmic workplace, sort of being tracked. Right.
And you talk about this illusion of managerial control, that you can imagine any of these companies, particularly someone like a company like Deliveroo, where the workers are very distant from this control center. They're on bikes riding around town. But what's going on here in terms of that illusion? Because it seems to me that it's not just the workers that don't know what's going on. It's also partly Deliveroo that doesn't really know what's going on. And I'm thinking that this could itself be a space where we might start to see some avenues for resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So I think that it's definitely the case that these companies intend to make their processes opaque, because it sort of reinforces the sense of informational asymmetry between workers who feel like they have no information really, and the presumption often that the company has all the information. Well, of course, in a sense, the company sort of does have the information because it's sort of tied up in the algorithmic system, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like managers themselves have greater insight into the process, and I'm sure we'll get onto that. But in terms of resistance, I think it's important to keep this whole idea in mind because, of course, and this ties back to the idea of the sort of how these companies sort of project themselves as being sort of sleek and frictionless. It would be easy to look at a system like algorithmic management and think, well, this is just like a total tracking system. There is like everything is accounted for. There can be no possibility of resistance. And like if, we can sort of almost fall into this trap of putting ourselves into like the remainder of what we imagine is left uncharted by the algorithm. But of course, to do that is to kind of accept this illusion as real.
Thinking about the media a little bit, I mean, as somebody who works in the media, but also just as a media consumer, I have become very used to the idea that the algo is, controlling not just what I see, but also who gets to see what I put out, right? So whether that is who gets to see Novara Media's Instagram post about a genocide, or the fact that overnight this week, all of my Instagram ads switched to furniture companies because I am sure that it heard me talking about chairs, But it really feels like we have imbued the algorithm with a sort of godlike omniscience, basically.
Yeah.
We talk about it as this kind of cozy big brother effectively, and we're talking about how to play it or game it rather than like breaking it or refusing it outright. So, I mean, what's going on here? Because we seem to have allowed this opaque thing, the algorithm, and its, you know, many varieties. There obviously isn't just one algorithm, but this thing which is really barely understood by most of us, to totally reshape our working lives and our social lives. Why do we let technology make these radical changes when we won't even let politicians do universal broadband?
I kind of think so. I think we often have this like objectivist view towards like technological development, and we just sort of think of like the march of technological progress as this thing that happens sort of spontaneously, and it probably has something to do with like, you know, R&D departments and scientists and things like that. But what I really think about it is that I suspect we place the roots of the sort of highly softwareized digital mediation that we see now. I think we place its roots in probably like the computer boom of the 70s. And we think about it in terms of hardware and software, rather than placing its origin within the revolutions in administration and labor discipline in the early 20th century. And I think that over the course of the 20th century, unfortunately, the labor movement jettisoned many claims to the organization and administration of work. And so the idea that labor and administration is part of what we fight about and is part of what we see as politics gets a bit buried. Nowadays, you know, where value is kind of created across society, and we all know when we're using like social media platforms that we are kind of producers in some sense for these companies. Mm-hmm. That was already sort of like depoliticized. This sort of like extraction of value through like a digital process, technological process, I think was already depoliticized somewhat, or normalized. It's probably like the more neutral way to say it, over the course of the 20th century. And it's also the fact that we are sold these things as, you know, kind of convenience, often regardless of whether or not they're actually more convenient. And of course, you know, increasingly we see there's a whole sort of data capture industry, whether it's around sort of ubiquitous QR codes or fintech, etc.
I like QR codes. They're good. They took a while to catch on, but I feel like they're functional.
I'm not sure about QR code. I'm kind of a QR code hater, actually. Not least because I think that when it comes to sort of, you know, restaurant menus and all this sort of nonsense, it's rarely more convenient than actually like going to the place. But you know, through my sort of research, I looked at some patents, for example, and there's a section in the book about barcodes. But I looked at sort of the patents that Amazon has taken out of things like augmented reality goggles to aid movement around the fulfillment center. And these things are all sort of like predicated on QR codes, quick reaction codes, to create sort of data tracking points within the built environment.
Okay, that's put me off a little bit. Let's get to what is often the final question, right in the middle, actually, which is the what is to be done question. Mm-hmm. Now, in particular, in the book, you look to the autonomist Marxists of 1970s Italy to help you sort of frame this question. And I suppose, you know, for them, that means putting the workers back into a sort of primary position, right? And seeing workers struggle as the primary thing, and then seeing technology, capitalist technology of production, as something that is actually partly a reaction to workers' struggle, right? So we usually think of technology as being the result of innovation within an industry, you know, like disruption within the space, mm-hmm. with the goal of creating value, creating more surplus value. But an autonomist might say that the technological developments in the organisation of work are something that is actually used to control the working class, which is obviously partly because it's in the nature of human labour to be difficult to control, like how hard we work and how focused we are at work. So thinking about some of this sort of inversion, this like autonomist view of the relation between labour and capital, can you tell me why you think this is particularly useful for us in explaining and understanding algorithmic management? And where is it leading you in terms of your kind of conception of worker power and therefore opportunities for a fight back?
I think that this kind of autonomous analysis is useful because it allows us to see technological and capitalist development as a political struggle rather than merely an economic imperative. And, if we believe that change comes about through political struggle, then I think it helps us kind of locate it. And of course, the capitalist class would love to have us believe that there was no struggle here. It's merely, the march of progress, for example. Mm. What it helps us do is to see the working class as part of that struggle and not just a spectator. As you say, the actualization of labour power is the fundamentally unplannable element of the capitalist social relation. And I think that this kind of continual battle and striving for control, also because the fact that it's never settled, it's never fully settled, I think shows the possibility and potential of, workers' agency, really, because capitalists have never fully succeeded in, sort of like settling this once and for all. There have always been, whether it's demands that have come up or whether it's the actions of workers that have arisen, in that kind of response to capitalist development, that capitalists have subsequently kind of like had to respond to sort of shore up their position. I think that's kind of politically potent, this kind of sense of agency and locating fundamentally the sort of autonomy of the working class as the sort of motor of capitalism. Mm. Obviously, then the question remains that, isn't sort of solved within that equation is like, okay, what are like the forms of political agency available to us in a given moment? And I kind of think that the sort of like autonomous projects, and I particularly look at like operaismo, so like Italian autonomism, has historically, not always, but historically was concerned with locating the potential for agency and autonomy, especially when things look like we're losing.
Mm. But it's an interesting way to think about some of the things you describe in the book to do with the particular handheld device that each worker gets that they kind of rely on to tell them what to do, and that's obviously also recording their own productivity rates, for example, these wearable devices and the apps, because it kind of changes your conception of what they're for. It'd be easy to look at that and think, well, that's just the best possible, most efficient way for the company to get value from the worker. Mm-hmm. But actually, it feels like to me what you're saying is that we can see those devices as much more of a tool of controlling the worker and of trying to control that kind of indeterminate nature of their labour.
Exactly. I mean, to take just take that one example. A lot of the workplaces I look at, workers have either a scan gun or like a kind of like a wearable. It's the same thing fundamentally, but it's kind of like a device that they may be strapped to their forearm. The Motorola WT4000 is a good example. It's like a big kind of smartphone looking thing. It weighs about 400 grams and it goes onto the forearm and it has a ring scanner. So the person who's wearing it doesn't have to pick it up and put it down in order to carry boxes around and can just sort of point and scan rather than having to press a button, for example. And so like within these workplaces, so much communication, just fundamental communication, is redirected away from being a human-to-human interaction of any kind, which of course is fraught with possibility from the perspective of the capitalist planner, and it is instead redirected through the data terminal into kind of like a finite set of forms. This sort of redirection into sort of like a datafied form of communication, which is firmly kind of like on the managerial or the sort of like, employer's side of the sort of frontier of control, sort of robs, I think, workers of the ability to generate bonds of sociality that could be the grounds of something more potent, for example. I think it's in, many of these workplaces, particularly where people are in very sort of poor working conditions, it's in the boss's interest not to really have them get to know each other. which sounds so like elementary, but it's also like elemental. Like it really is like a fundamental building block. If anyone wants to organize in their workplace, they know, and anyone who's listened, who's done it or tried it, knows you have to begin by talking to people. And so if you have an easy sort of like techno fix for workers talking to each other, if you're looking at things from the other side of the class struggle, then it makes sense to you.
Exactly, yeah. For me, unsurprisingly, some of the most fun bits of the book are your descriptions of the various ways that workers are resisting the power of algorithmic management, the various things that they're getting up to. But you do, I think, very accurately point out that the word resistance is, it can feel like a bit of a cop-out, really. It's nothing anywhere near a revolution. It's not even a struggle. Resistance is this word that sort of suggests that like the best we can hope for is to put the brakes on capitalism a bit, slow it down a bit, but never quite get anywhere near overthrowing it. But you point that out, but also some of the examples that you give of worker resistance in these workplaces, I mean, they might seem a little bit small fry, dare I say. So tell us a bit about the kind of things that they were getting up to and what you think their aims actually were.
Yeah, okay. So I give like a few different examples of forms of like resistance or refusal that emerge within these workplaces that I looked at. I think the most intriguing one was a slowdown that happened in a workplace where agency workers were paid 70% of what staff workers were paid. And the workers who began to organise this action were agency workers, and they weren't enamored with the union and interested in getting involved because the union was only interested in representing the staff workers, and had subsequently kind of become quite close to management over time. Agency workers began kind of getting together in a pub, and they wanted to do something about the fact they were being paid 70% of what staff workers were being paid for the same work. And they settled on having a slowdown. And so they wanted to sort of symbolically slow their work down to 70% of the productivity target. Now, this was especially important because this whole workplace was really completely governed by the productivity target. In fact, workers, when they wake up in the morning, they get a text message telling them what their productivity score was for the previous day, and subsequently whether, therefore, their shift on the present day has been cancelled or confirmed. And so there's a direct relationship between labour allocation and their productivity. Now, because they're obviously used to working to the required productivity, and they over time develop a kind of tacit sense for what that feels like to know they've done enough to secure work the following day, it also meant that they were able to sort of modulate their own effort through this slowdown, and sort of began working slowly, not so slowly, but they wanted to kind of get things to around 70%. It was definitely noticeable on the shop floor. And sure enough, when they got their productivity text messages the next day, along with a bunch of cancelled shifts because they unfortunately got ratted out, but they had sort of achieved this sort of 70%, and so they'd been able to kind of modulate their quite embodied relationship with the algorithm essentially, to sort of pursue this target that they had in mind. Now, I think that's quite impressive, but I think that there are certainly other examples in the book that might seem almost kind of churlish. So
they're more ad hoc, aren't they? Some of the others, they're more kind of familiar to a sort of general sense of dossing around a bit at work, but perhaps pushing it a bit further, getting longer breaks and so on. The action that you described, I think, really could be described as an organised action, but some of the other ones are much more, ad hoc, I would say.
Yeah, that's fair. So one example is of a code that gets kind of passed around the workplace secretly that allows people to kind of opt out of the productivity system for a period of time and allows them to go on an unsanctioned break. Unsanctioned breaks were quite a popular theme when I was chatting to people because the work is hard, and sort of monotonous. One other place, someone kept sort of fiddling around with the controls and realized that pressing certain actions this was an online shopping department, pressing certain actions such as, saying that first that one item wouldn't fit in the trolley and then that every item wouldn't fit in the trolley would get the person to the end of their shop quicker so they could go on their break, or that switching devices would give them the option to continue or quit their shop, and they could just choose to quit the shop and go on a break, for example. Another one, when I mentioned the sort of churlishness, is the one degree of autonomy that a worker I spoke to had in an online shopping department was that they had some degree of autonomy over product substitutions, and he chose to substitute any DVD that came in for Star Wars Rogue One, because in his words, it's a sick film and more people should see it. Which, might give some sort of like small reputational damage to the company or something. It's just a bit of a sort of twos up. Now, of course, these actions, even slow down to some extent, are kind of like have this like individualist kind of dimension to them. And the people who were talking to me about these, like, for a start, like these conversations kind of came about organically, so I sort of pursued them. And like many of these kind of actions themselves, another one, for example, was sort of snooping into supervisors' computers. But the people who were telling me these stories were themselves sort of lamenting their kind of like apparent individualism, really. And I think that what I'm really was interested in was thinking about some of the kind of underlying principles. And it got me thinking about actually the secrecy that we were talking about earlier, and how these workplaces often kind of operate under this blanket of kind of opacity. And then within them, we're kind of getting further sort of secret forms of like refusal and resistance. And it made me think that, there is actually a struggle, a tradition of struggle that is less rooted in the Western workplace and more rooted in sort of colonial contexts of work that recognized how the genesis of resistance can often begin in a clandestine way. And so someone like James C. Scott, for example, the anthropologist, like looked at this in a book on the arts of resistance. Now, I find that kind of interesting because I think it could, maybe optimistically, but it kind of points to a potential for broadening, let's say, the organizing repertoire when we're thinking about what it means to sort of wage politics at work. And I suppose, without wanting to seem sort of churlish myself, like it's important to remember that under algorithmic management, even strikes can be small fry, actually. The days of the kind of the general strike are kind of over. Strikes tend to be sort of one-day affairs, and then people go back to work. So that in any form of action, there's no such thing as a kind of true resistor. And the idea of the sort of the revolutionary at work is maybe a bit quaint now almost. But if you take, for example, like the place where there's been the longest campaign of strikes against Amazon, which is in Germany, where the first ever strike against Amazon was with the Verdi General Union. And they went on strike and lost many days were lost to strikes over the course of years. And, some of the things they ended up winning were like better lighting and ventilation and free fruit in the canteen. So I do think we need to have some perspective and maybe even some sort of humility about where we're all at in relation to these systems. And I don't think there's necessarily anything to be lost in thinking about the ways that workers themselves, even quite without the instruction or assistance of unions, are thinking for themselves about how they can stake their own claim within the algorithmic workplace.
There was one quite interesting strike that you mentioned that I thought did really take advantage of the new situation, which was this wildcat strike that you described from Deliveroo riders, which was organised, I guess, via a WhatsApp instead, obviously off of their app systems, but kind of took advantage of the fact that because Deliveroo doesn't class them as employees, it classes them as independent contractors, then they just all logged off the app on the same day, and there was nothing that Deliveroo could really do about that. But I mean, I don't know how that's not the same as agitating for a demand and presenting it. That's more of a protest in a way, isn't it?
It is a process, yeah. I mean, so it has obviously been noted that, like, although this is kind of like a wildcat action, I mean, calling it probably a wildcat strike is, so we can get into like the sort of technical definitions, but of course it is like a sort of like a, a withdrawal of labour, and particularly when organised, for example, on a Friday night or something, can have an enormously disruptive effect. And of course it is recognising, I think that what's interesting about those actions is that it also recognises the role of the work those drivers and riders do in relation to the restaurants that Deliveroo is trying to pitch itself to, for example. And so it's not just about sort of fucking things up for Deliveroo, but also kind of getting the restaurants to almost agitate on the driver's behalf.
Absolutely. Just going back to this idea of opacity again that you brought up again just a second ago, this whole feeling of unknowability as a kind of condition of this like cybernetically controlled workplace, I guess. I did think managers themselves not being sure of what the workers are doing, there's a kind of bigger sense, it seems to feed into this contemporary feeling that our lives are out of our control. We're all at the mercy of an opaque system, manager and worker alike. Possibly quite a Adam Curtis coded thought, maybe, but not to worry too much about how the managers are doing. But I do wonder if the managers also feel similarly about their jobs.
Yeah, I was actually just speaking to some sociologists of work who have been chatting to managers in logistics, and this is very much how they're feeling. So, like, I think the thing is that the algorithmic system within these workplaces is built on an unknowability to some extent. And that's kind of important to remember, because often I think we tend to think about such technologies as being a tool in managers' hands, which like isn't not the case, because clearly it's the source of, for example, metrics that can then subsequently be used by managers to discipline workers. But it does kind of mean it represents a bit of a third source of power within the workplace. And as such, I think it kind of goes hand in hand with quite a fundamental sort of reorganization. If we think about sort of like the knowledge politics of the workplace, it leads to kind of this sort of like almost like epistemological hollowing out of, for example, like the supervisory layer within the workplace. And instead, a lot of those kinds of sort of lower level managers, or like the sort of daily managers that we'd expect to see on the shop floor and not in a boardroom somewhere, their role turns towards being almost kind of like pastoral, I found. Like if in some workplaces, one way I typify it in the book is that, like, in some workplaces it's almost like the algorithm is taking on this kind of like theological quality. Like a lot of the managers walk around saying, just trust the algorithm, just trust the system. And so in that sense, like the managers are almost taking on this kind of like ecclesiastical role, as kind of like sort of like shepherding their flock towards like, the one truth of the algorithm, Now obviously like that whole aspect of the system can also kind of be to like managerial benefit. I talk about like managerial distanciation in the book, and how it allows managers to not be actually present kind of at the point of labour intensification, and to have this kind of plausible deniability in relation to the demands of the system, and therefore to kind of provide this kind of more like humanistic, or if we prefer like theological kind of buttress towards this like hard, brutal algorithmic system. But it also, I think, like presents some of the cracks. I mean, the interesting thing about the example earlier with the worker swapping out DVDs for Rogue One is that he never got caught doing that, because there was no way that they could check up on him, because the system would take his substitutions seriously and change the stock inventory on that basis. So, he might say, to take a mundane example that's not a sort of resistance example, if there's no Marmite on the shelves and he chose to substitute it for Vegemite, which is not a great idea, but let's say he did, then the system would update and say, well, there's no Marmite on the shelves, and they'd take his information as kind of stock inventory information and would change the orders of subsequent people and say there's going to be no Marmite on the shelves, you might want to substitute it for Vegemite. And so he's having this sort of interaction with the system that he's sort of finding out, what the affordances are through sort of playing around with it. And it's certainly also finding out that the managers don't necessarily know a great deal more than the workers.
But we don't need to feel sorry for them too much. I noticed that you are not convinced that trade unions have got the solutions to any or many of these problems. Is that because the trade unions that we've got are, for various reasons, kind of not up to the task, whether that's because, larger unions have grown too close to managers in some sense, whether they haven't caught up with technology, or is it something more historical? Is it that unions are kind of no longer up to the task of fighting for workers' rights when the working class is, no longer this kind of organisable mass that sees itself collectively? I
say at the beginning of the book that I don't make any sort of concession to, the hateful sort of anti-union legislation that we've seen over the past 40 years or so, but it is the area of the book that has sort of landed most provocatively with some readers, because, of course, in some sense, unions are what we have. But, I can't remember the last time I heard a union talking about like getting rid of capitalism, for example, which I think is a pretty important thing for improving workers' lives. So I think it's about political choices, both around focus, by which I mean unions, and I go into why historically this has been the case, but it just is the fact that unions generally will focus on recognition, and then they'll focus on pay, things like pensions, sort of terms of employment, and not really on the actual organisation of work, which falls under the manager's right to manage. But I think it's also to do with political choices around form and action. And so form being, recognition and really privileging the sort of formal relationship with managers over all else sometimes. And also action and sticking to quite a sort of narrow organising repertoire, and not necessarily thinking about how we might have to change that. I do think it's the case that unions, one of the reasons they're often on the back foot against technology is not actually because of the rate of change within technological development. I think it's because unions themselves are often too quick to accept the premise. And so they might talk about, for example, greater transparency or explainability of algorithmic systems or AI, but that already accepts the premise of introducing those things into the workplace in the first place. And for what it's worth, I don't think that there's any kind of like bit of code inside the supposed black box of the algorithmic system that would, help us understand, the effect it has on work and the power relationships in the workplace. We're talking about politics, not kind of like, sort of technical insight into lines of code. And I also think it's because leaderships are often stuck in their ways. Anyone who, it's worth saying, like, I am and have been a trade unionist, all my adult life. And anyone who's organized inside a trade union or has gone to a trade union sort of congress or conference will know that there is an internal kind of establishment, within trade unions that often is reluctant and resistant to change.
If I could go back briefly to the idea of tracking devices and capture, I know plenty of people who really enjoy using the kind of apps and devices that can capture and quantify and track their habits, in order that they can make some progress towards a particular goal that they want. And I think it can be quite easy, perhaps particularly on the left, to kind of write this off as a sort of sheeple behavior, this critique of our obsession with productivity, because being productive is actually just capital pilled, and you're just too obsessed with your self-worth as like a producer of value rather than as a human being. But the thing is that making your life more efficient in order that you can achieve things that you want to achieve is in many ways quite normal human behavior to me. This is why we have so many of the tools that we have. And I was thinking about Lillian Gilbreth, who you mention in the book, who in the first half of the 20th century was inventing this thing called time and motion studies with her husband to make the workplace more efficient, basically. But she also wanted to make her own life as a woman, as a housewife, more efficient. And she invented all of these things that saved her time. She invented an electric mixer. She invented a rubbish bin that opened with a foot pedal. And I guess my question here is there potentially some contradiction here between embracing labour-saving or productivity-enhancing devices in our own lives, but rejecting them in the workplace?
Well, I think the fundamental difference is that in our broader lives, saving labour, whether it's administration or housework, or even, if you're kind of self-employed, sort of like maximising your gain and reducing the input that you have to put into it, frees us up to have more free time. Obviously not always, people's lives all look different, but I think that's generally why people would want to do it, so that they have more free time. Of course, in the sort of bounds of a workplace and the employment relationship, it creates the possibility of more work and more value for the company. And so, if you're at work and you sort of radically labor saved and sort of squeeze your productivity, you're just going to get given more work to do, rather than being able to sort of be kind of let off. But I think in relation to like algorithmic management, what's interesting is, Lillian Gilbreth is a really interesting example. So like Lillian and Frank Gilbreth, they're kind of in conversation with Taylor. Taylor is like the sort of, he's often thought of as the person who like sort of put the stopwatch to the work, and sort of time how long tasks take and what they bring to the table through really innovative methods at the time, such as using sort of moving images, with cameras, or experiments with sort of like long exposure photography, and putting light bulbs onto workers' heads and hands, wanted to sort of trace workers' motions. And in the back of their mind, what they had was this sort of sense that there is a one best way, like a one most optimal way to perform an action, such as laying bricks was like a classic example, but also maybe working on an assembly line. But what algorithmic management does is it builds on kind of another management history of continuous improvement, where there's no one best way you can ever kind of hope to achieve. You can have the sort of one best way for now, but then when the conditions change, it's going to change and constantly improve and be optimized. And so it's sort of like a one best way that's almost sort of held in flux as an idea, but won't materialize in one particular way to perform an activity. And I think it probably goes hand in hand with, as you were saying earlier, the sort of like complexities of the way that sort of production is organized, which we obviously are. We might want to say that our lives have become sort of more complex today than they were 70 years ago. But in many ways they're also kind of not. And many of the tasks that we might want to optimize would be fundamentally quite routine tasks, where maybe there is kind of like an efficient way of doing them to sort of free up that extra time.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the time that Gilbreth was inventing the electric mixer and so on, I mean, she would have been something of a rarity in the career that she did have. And you could argue that mainly one of the results of all of these labour-saving household devices being introduced was that women could spend less time at home and therefore go to work, which has, had its own kind of cascading effect of bringing us into a overall slightly worse position as workers.
Exactly.
Not that I would wish to be a housewife instead, but there are a lot of things that you can't get done when there isn't somebody at home making your dinner.
Quite.
Talking of which, I feel like it's become a really basic signifier of class status, middle class status, to be somebody who gets stuff delivered to your house instead of being someone who delivers stuff to your house, right? So you're either someone who orders a Deliveroo or you might be someone who delivers it. And I think in the US in particular, I feel like I hear so much about people just get everything delivered to their house, especially in big cities like New York, where something like DoorDash seems to be a replacement for like having an apartment big enough to have a kitchen in it and all of this. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about how through economies of scale, the city becomes almost like a kind of distributed servant for the middle class. Like there are aspects now of 21st century city life that feel, I'm going to say, cyber Dickensian to me, and I find it really hard to actually imagine achieving an even slightly more equal society when these technologies have become so pervasive. And I think this is the sort of thing that left-wing accelerationists were talking about 10 years ago. But, even in 10 years, a lot has happened. And I think it's fair to say that you don't hear so much from the left-wing accelerationists at the moment. So, yeah, I wonder where you are in terms of that conversation about the idea that those technologies can be put to better use, perhaps through, universal basic income or something. Because obviously our colleague Aaron Bastani has written a lot about this idea of fully automated luxury communism. But I always thought that you were not necessarily of that school of thought. And I wonder how your thinking might have evolved on that in recent years.
Cyber Dickens is a great name for a book. I would definitely read that. I suppose, at the time when, when obviously the sort of left-wing accelerationism was kind of a sort of forefront of sort of like a lot of left thinking, I suppose it went hand in hand with thinking about a post-work society and what that would look like. Just on the point of the kind of who is the deliverer and who is being delivered to. Clearly, there are some people who will never be the deliverers, but the workers I spoke to also didn't kind of necessarily blame consumers for choosing convenience. And the reason being that in the particular areas where they were often delivering to people, and, obviously maybe have a split second to kind of form an opinion, but they got the impression that they were often delivering to people who themselves had busy and perhaps even quite precarious kind of lives. They might be, delivering a meal on a weeknight at 11 p.m. and it's not that someone's, staying up and getting, on the piss, but it's just that they've come in from work late, for example, or, they've ordered their shopping to arrive at 6 a.m. And it's quite clear that they've just come home from work, for example. However, I do probably think now, having researched and written this book, that some of these technologies simply cannot be present, or these ways of organising work cannot be present in a more equal society, which is probably not where I expected to end up. I certainly think that, if we want to meaningfully change society, we will have to wave goodbye to next day delivery and certainly same day delivery. Unless we're to radically reorganize the way that distribution itself actually works, and to say, well, instead of having small shops and having large distribution centers sort of dotted around the country, we're instead going to have smaller distribution hubs where it's all stored very sort of locally. But I think it's interesting how in France, for example, they've introduced a minimum. They've got rid of free delivery and introduced a minimum delivery charge. and it's made people think twice about, buying something on Amazon and then 4 hours later putting in another Amazon order, and instead sort of grouping their orders.
So that applies to Amazon as well. That's interesting.
That's my understanding. I'm willing to be corrected if listeners know differently, but that's my understanding. Someone like Kirsty Newsome, who's sort of sociologist of work, has done a lot of work on last mile delivery and how a lot of the kind of labour exploitation, the worst sort of excesses that we can think of, really happen in organising for that last mile of delivery to happen. I think one of the frameworks I sort of bring to the book and why I'm interested in the effect of these technologies on work, for example, is because I actually don't think there's any amount of fixing, wages or job security that would make some of these forms of work much better. Because I think that, what they do is rob people of dignity and opportunity and the potential to organise to improve their conditions, for example. And I think in that context, we have to think about what the effects of the technology itself is. Now, of course, the technology doesn't have a logic all of itself. It's imbued with, logic of class struggle, essentially. But at the same time, I don't think it's simply the case that we could sort of almost hope to drag and drop the technologies of present day capitalism and put them into a future sort of socialist or communist utopia and not expect them to squeeze labour in the same way.
I wanted to ask about the racial dimensions of algorithmic management, actually, and I mean, related to what we've just been saying, what the kind of longer term prospects are for a society that is increasingly separated into what feels like a kind of underclass of like I say, sort of distributed servants, or that, I mean, you raised that there are lots of reasons why people who order deliveries might not be of a middle class status necessarily, but they certainly might be time poor and therefore rely on those services for their food, for their shopping, whatever reason. But this is a society that is, I think, increasingly racially segregated, it seems to me, for lots of reasons. In fact, Novara Media's Dalia Gabriel has done some interesting work related to this, looking at Uber and what she calls racial platform capitalism. And she puts forward the idea that it's actually migration itself and race become a kind of structuring logic of platform capitalism rather than the other way round. And I just wondered if that's something that came up in your inquiry talking to workers, because you mentioned at one point that you have heard about tension between workers kind of along racial lines. And I just feel like looking to the future, again, it's hard to imagine a more racially equitable society, let alone economically equitable one with this technology, because of course we increasingly depend on, for example, migrant workers to fill gaps in all of our social services, let alone delivery drivers. But yeah, what did you find out when you spoke to workers about this?
So this came up a couple of times. One was in a sort of logistics hub where it was more that the sort of workers of different national origins, but all migrants to Britain, would sort of end up having sort of arguments with each other or being sort of competitive with one another and sort of tribalist or sectarian in the workplace. Another area where it became a particular sort of barrier to organising was in Deliveroo, where moped riders were generally Brazilian and migrants to Britain, and the cyclists were in this particular place often students and white. And I should say that this was, the book was kind of written just before the big kind of uptick in e-bikes, which I think has complicated the whole picture. But, I would hold my hands up and say that I think this is a kind of underexplored area of the book. And if I could sort of do it again, it'd be one of the first things I'd kind of want to address. And certainly, as you say, Dalia Gabriel's work on this is a good starting point for listeners. And also Gabriella Alberti has done a lot of work around migrant workers in this regard as well. But I guess what I would say and what I sort of, think about in the book in relation to it is that we obviously know that there's a long history of bosses exploiting these kinds of xenophobic or racist divisions among workers. But it can also be counterproductive to the functioning of, if you want a sort of smoothly operating logistical hub, then having workers arguing with each other kind of overtly on the shop floor can be highly sort of counterproductive. What I actually found was that it often also fed into this idea of a two-tier workforce, either a real one, such as between agency and in-house staff, which was the case in the logistical hub, or a perceived one, which was the experience of some workers when they were trying to organize in Deliveroo and feeling that moped riders actually were getting preferential treatment because they were able to have a higher productivity because obviously they're on faster vehicles.
Finally, and somewhat inevitably, I feel like this question is replacing the what is to be done question as the kind of natural endpoint to these sorts of interviews these days. But you don't really mention AI much in the book, maybe if at all, until the epilogue. But I suppose the spectre of AI must have been kind of looming larger and larger as you were writing, particularly as you were getting to the end of writing it, with all of these quite mind-boggling advances just popping up in the past couple of years, every few weeks even. But in the epilogue, you write admiringly of the writers' strikes in the USA and how the Writers Guild of America has taken really an unusually hardline approach against AI, basically saying we don't want it, we want to suppress it, which seems both very impressive and somehow unrealistic to me, but at least they are looking and acting like quite a powerful trade union. Other trade unions, as you alluded to earlier in this conversation, have taken a different approach and lean towards the idea of explainability, the idea that you would just be able to explain what the AI or what the algorithm is doing, that would make it acceptable to the union. Now, without wanting to open up another whole episode's worth of questions, and just as a final question, do you see artificial intelligence as a distinct new problem coming down the tracks, or is it really an extension of the problem of automation?
I mention artificial intelligence by name on the first page, and then not until the epilogue, as you say, where I kind of like confront it head on. And the reason for that really is because it's easy to forget that artificial intelligence sort of isn't a thing. Or more precisely, it means lots of different things that are all quite distinct from one another. So, it means large language models and natural language processing, but it also means computer vision, and it also means monitoring software, and it also means sort of personalization and recommendation algorithms. And I would say it also means algorithmic management. So I would say that algorithmic management does come under that umbrella because, of course, increasing amounts of both kind of scholarly and journalistic work and also struggle are showing that although, this kind of, I don't want to say knowledge, but, let's say the intelligence part is synthetic, artificial belies the amount of human labor, including human knowledge and intelligence that is actually involved in generating it in the first place. So I would say that algorithmic management is a type of AI, but I think it's more important to kind of cut through the kind of hype to the actual working. The reason I wanted to address AI sort of squarely in the epilogue is because clearly AI as a sort of an idea, whatever people mean by it, is kind of generating its own currency now, kind of within a zeitgeist. I suppose what I would say in relation to whether it's a kind of a new problem coming down the tracks or an extension of a new problem. I mean, it's certainly new, the sort of scale and potential power of computation that we're seeing, and I think that an examination of algorithmic management sort of sets that up perfectly and looks in quite concrete ways at some of the things we might expect to come from the increased application of computation to work. But as I mentioned before, I would sort of locate that history really in a much longer history of kind of labor administration and discipline than simply just a kind of like a history of computing, for example. Now, I think that the Writers Guild of America strike was particularly interesting because of their sort of radical stance of suppression, which really they kind of had to take up because, I think that what underpins or what is there kind of in the background, sometimes overtly and sometimes not, or but implicitly within a lot of trade union kind of like demands for explainability or transparency, is this idea of trade unions wanting to sort of quote unquote share the benefit of AI. And I think the Writers Guild of America were, forced very obviously, without much struggle, to recognize that there is not a particular benefit of AI for its members. And nor can it hang, concerns about AI on the sort of thin ledge of health and safety concerns, because that doesn't really sort of come into the picture. But it's still clearly, particularly at the level of the labour market, is a mechanism of labour discipline to enforce workers into worse contracts and conditions and so on. And so, I think the stance they took was far in advance of most of the rest of the trade union movement. And, lo and behold, they won. And whether they will continue to win in the future when future contracts are negotiated is, obviously a question that no one can answer right now. However, it does kind of set the debate on the union's terms rather than on the managers, and that's new.
Fantastic. Craig Gent, thank you so much for being on Novara FM.
Thank you for having me.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.